I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the wrench roll across the floor on its own, as if an invisible hand had just finished using it. I've worked on the North Sea rigs for years, but nothing prepared me for the night. I learned there are 11 rules you have to follow if you want to survive up here, especially when the machines come alive before the crew does. I remember the first time I broke one of the rules, how the lights dimmed and the engine room seemed to breathe around me. I still don't understand what I heard behind me that night, or why it whispered my name. I remember the first night I heard one of the turbines spinning, even though no one was scheduled to start it, and that's when I forced myself to recall Rule 1. Never approach a machine that starts running on its own after midnight, even though a part of me still wanted to believe it had some logical cause. The engine room felt colder than usual, colder than metal should ever feel, and every step I took made it seem like the floor was tilting away from me, as if something underneath the rig had shifted its weight. I kept telling myself the turbine must have caught a pressure surge, that maybe the storm outside had affected the line. But deep down I already knew the difference between a normal startup and whatever that quiet humming was. It wasn't a human-engineered vibration. It had a slow, almost breathing-like rhythm that didn't match anything built by our hands, and that alone made the skin on my arms tighten until I could feel every hair standing. I moved closer to the maintenance panel, keeping my steps slow so I wouldn't alert anyone or anything to my presence, because the last thing I wanted was to trigger movement in a room full of machines that shouldn't even be awake. The overhead lights flickered in a way that wasn't chaotic, but almost deliberate, like a pulse syncing with the turbine's slow whirring, and for a moment I wondered if the entire room was adjusting itself to welcome me. I didn't want to admit that idea even existed in my mind, but it did. It felt like the place had eyes hidden inside the metal casings, watching to see if I'd break caution and get close. I reached for the panel key on my belt, my fingers shaking slightly, not from fear but from the strange buzzing in the air that made everything feel charged. It reminded me of the static you get before lightning hits, except this time there was no storm inside, just something else waiting. When I was about to insert the key, the turbine released a burst of warm air that wasn't forceful but strangely soft, almost like it was sighing at me, and I jerked my hand back instinctively before I could think. This wasn't how faulty machinery behaved. This was how something aware behaved, and the realization settled heavy in my chest, like a weight I couldn't lift. I turned slowly, scanning the empty aisles of machinery lined up like metallic giants asleep on their feet, each one silent except the single turbine that seemed to be testing me. The engine room was huge, bigger than most people imagined, and at night it became a cavern of shadows stretching across steel beams, giving shape to things that shouldn't exist. My radio crackled softly on my shoulder, but no voice came through, just a faint disturbance like someone breathing too close to the microphone, and the hairs on the back of my neck tightened all at once. I stepped back from the turbine, careful not to break eye contact, even though the machine had no actual eyes, but it felt like it did, hidden somewhere behind the spinning metal. The old mechanic who trained me used to say the rig reacts differently at night, but he never explained what he meant, and I always assumed it was just the way older workers talked to scare rookies. Now, standing in front of a machine that had awakened itself, I finally understood he wasn't trying to scare me. He was warning me. The humming dropped suddenly to a lower pitch, almost like a growl, slow and heavy, and it vibrated through the floor directly into my boots in a way that made my bones feel fragile. Every instinct in my body told me to turn around and leave. Not run but walk, steady and calm, because sudden movements felt like a bad idea. As I backed up, my flashlight beam slid across the walls, reflecting off tools hanging neatly in place. None of them touched or disturbed, and yet the wrench I had used earlier lay in the middle of the walkway, where I knew I hadn't left it. It was positioned perfectly parallel to the yellow line on the floor, as if deliberately set down with intention, not dropped by accident. For a moment I convinced myself maybe I had forgotten picking it up. Maybe I had placed it there without realizing it, but the knot in my stomach tightened because the placement was too clean. Someone or something had moved it after I left earlier. I crouched slightly, not touching it, just observing the way the metal seemed warmer than the surrounding air, almost inviting, almost asking me to pick it up again. I didn't. The low humming began to rise in tone again, slowly, steadily, as if responding to my hesitation, and I straightened up quickly before the machine could change its behavior. The lights dimmed one by one along the far wall, not shutting off completely, but lowering just enough to narrow my field of vision, and that terrified me more than if they had gone completely dark. Controlled light meant controlled observation, and controlled observation meant something wanted me to act a certain way. I took another step back, feeling the rail behind me, grounding myself so I didn't stumble, because I knew instinctively that falling in front of these machines would be a mistake. The turbine spinning grew uneven for a moment, like it was choking, sucking in air in ragged pulls that made my body tense. Then it steadied again as if regaining its composure. The room felt alive, everything breathing, everything listening. I reached for my radio again, gripping it tight as if the device could anchor me to reality, and whispered for the night watch to confirm their location, hoping someone would answer and break the suffocating silence around me. Instead of a voice, I heard faint static shifting like fabric moving across metal, and then something like a whispering exhale came through, soft and close, too close, as if someone was behind me speaking directly at the radio. My throat tightened, and I didn't dare turn around, knowing deep inside that whatever the sound was, it wasn't from a human crew member. The machines around me stood still, silent monuments of steel, but the air around them felt subtly disturbed, moving in patterns I couldn't see but could feel brushing the back of my neck. I knew I had to leave the room, not because I was scared, though I was, but because it felt like staying longer would give the machine permission to do something else, something I wasn't prepared for. I stepped sideways along the railing, keeping my eyes on the turbine, refusing to blink too long in case it changed its behavior the moment my vision slipped. The warm air it had released earlier seemed to cling to the floor now, creating a thin layer of invisible heat that rose in slow waves, distorting the space between me and the machine. It reminded me of looking at road pavement under the sun, except this heat wasn't natural, and the source wasn't harmless. It was trying to draw me closer. When I finally reached the exit hatch, my hand froze on the handle, because the humming behind me suddenly stopped, completely, instantly, unnaturally. Machines don't stop like that. They wind down, slow, delayed, but this one halted as if someone had hit a switch inside it with perfect precision. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the turbine in the corner of my vision, and although it stood still, silent and dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me to fully turn around. I didn't. I pushed the hatch open, stepped out, and pulled it shut behind me, feeling the faintest vibration against the metal door just before the latch clicked into place. It wasn't spinning anymore, and yet it felt more alive than ever, and that's when I realized something worse. Someone had opened the maintenance panel behind it. The moment I stepped out of the turbine room, the memory of Rule 2, never touch the control panel of a machine that awakens itself, no matter what it displays, anchored itself in my mind, a warning that screamed louder than any engine roar could. My hands itched to check the panel, just to understand what had caused the turbine to start on its own, but I knew better than to give in. The corridor leading to the main deck was narrow, and the shadows from the overhead lights stretched long across the metal grates, twisting and converging into shapes my mind half wanted to ignore. Every step echoed unnaturally, a low vibration that seemed almost conversational, like the rig itself was murmuring at me, testing my patience, measuring my fear, daring me to forget the rules. The air smelled faintly of ozone and burnt metal, a scent I'd never noticed during normal shifts, but now it filled my lungs and made me aware of how alone I truly was. As I approached the junction to the engine room's secondary access, a flicker of movement caught the corner of my eye, a shadow, impossibly fluid, sliding along the walls in perfect synchronization with the dim lights. I forced my gaze forward, focusing on the rail beneath my boots, trying to suppress the adrenaline building in my chest. The storm outside had worsened, waves slamming against the rig's pillars in a relentless rhythm that made the entire structure shiver. Each shudder echoed up the decks, rattling doors, pipes and cables, and I was reminded again of the turbine's earlier activity. I had thought leaving that room would distance me from the danger, but the vibration in the hull was a persistent pulse, reminding me that nothing on this rig operated independently. Every movement, every hum was a language I didn't yet understand. I reached the control hub, a room I had walked past hundreds of times without giving it a second thought, but tonight it seemed alien. Screens glowed faintly in the dark, displaying readings that should have been stable, but now flickered, erratic and unpredictable. I resisted the urge to place my hands on the nearest console. Every instinct screamed not to, and yet curiosity clawed at the edges of my reason. The flashing lights weren't just malfunctioning, they felt sentient. I noticed a panel showing a turbine diagram with spinning indicators, mirroring the machine I had just left. My eyes followed the lines as they pulsed, almost like a heartbeat, synchronized with the vibration under my boots. The rig's machinery didn't simply function. It watched, and I was acutely aware that breaking Rule 2 might invite something I couldn't anticipate. The night watchman, Jensen, appeared at the entrance, his silhouette tense and uncertain. "You really shouldn't be here alone," he said, voice low but edged with disbelief. I glanced at him, remembering the rules, and nodded subtly. "I know," I whispered, keeping my voice steady, though every nerve screamed to run. Jensen stepped closer, peering at the screens with a mix of curiosity and fear. "Why are the readings jumping like that? Did you see the turbine? It started by itself," he muttered, half in awe, half in warning. I took a deep breath and said nothing, forcing him to look away, as I reminded myself silently that Rule 2 existed for a reason, that some curiosity could cost far more than I was prepared to pay. His brow furrowed, but he didn't press further, perhaps sensing the tension that radiated like heat off the control panels. I turned back to the displays, careful not to touch anything, and noticed that one screen had started showing an alert, red text blinking faintly, almost imperceptibly. My heart raced, but I resisted leaning forward to inspect it. The rig's lights flickered again, this time casting long, slanted shadows across the room that shifted as if they had lives of their own. I remembered every warning my mentor had drilled into me, each word echoing in the empty space. "Never touch an awake machine," he had said. "Even the panels speak only to those prepared to listen, not to those tempted to act." I felt the truth of that warning in every fiber of my body, as the temperature seemed to drop a fraction of a degree with every passing second. A sudden clatter from the upper deck made me spin, but no one was there. The rig's structural metal groaned, vibrating with the force of the waves outside, and yet the sound didn't come from the storm. It came from inside, a deliberate pressure that seemed to respond to my every movement. My hand brushed the edge of a railing instinctively, grounding myself, resisting the urge to reach out for the nearest console. The temptation was brutal, almost magnetic, but I knew the consequences would be immediate. Machines on this rig didn't forgive mistakes, and the turbine's previous behavior reminded me that even a single touch could trigger events far beyond comprehension. I forced myself to take measured steps back, keeping my eyes on the pulsing lights, without letting my mind wander toward interaction. Jensen watched me silently, a question in his eyes, but he didn't speak. The rig seemed to exhale around us, a low mechanical sigh that raised goosebumps on my arms. It was as if the entire structure knew our thoughts, our desires, and I realized with horror that the machines had memory, awareness beyond human design. I told myself the rule wasn't arbitrary, it wasn't caution for caution's sake. It existed because the machinery had intentions, and even the faintest engagement could disrupt the fragile balance that separated observation from interference. My feet ached from standing still, my muscles tensed from resisting, but I did not move closer. I couldn't. Even curiosity felt like a trap. The screens flickered once more, and then a message appeared briefly, almost subliminally, a single wordless symbol that seemed to move just as my eyes tried to focus. I felt the pull of my instincts telling me to press a button, to interact, to learn, but I shook my head violently, grounding myself in Rule 2. The vibrations beneath us intensified subtly, not chaotic but deliberate, like the rig was coaxing us to fail, to test our resolve. Every light, every flicker, every hum in the steel veins of the rig reinforced the invisible boundaries imposed by the rules. Jensen shifted nervously, sensing my restraint, and I wondered if he had ever truly believed the legends we had been warned about. I knew now that believing wasn't enough. Obedience was the only shield. The seconds stretched like hours, each heartbeat echoing in my ears louder than the turbine's earlier growl. I could feel the unseen gaze of the rig moving through the room, tracing my position with precision. The lights above flickered one last time, and then steadied, leaving the room in a dim, oppressive glow that made every corner feel like a potential threat. I told Jensen, "We need to move now," and we stepped toward the door leading to the maintenance stairwell, careful not to glance back at the panels. The temptation to look was immense, but my focus remained on survival, on the knowledge that Rule 2 existed to keep exactly this from happening. Any interaction could awaken more than just curiosity. As we exited the control hub, the hum of the turbine room faded, replaced by the distant rumble of waves and the faint vibration of other machinery deep within the rig. I dared a glance over my shoulder once we reached the stairwell, seeing the lights at the panels blink one final time before fading completely, as if acknowledging our restraint. My chest tightened, and a shiver ran down my spine, not from cold, but from the understanding that the rig was aware we had obeyed. Rule 2 had saved us, at least for now, but I knew instinctively that this was only the beginning. Something else was already stirring, preparing, and waiting for the next moment of weakness. We descended the stairs in silence, each step deliberate, carrying the knowledge that breaking any of the rules could have consequences beyond imagination. By the time we reached the lower decks, I could feel the storm outside battering the rig, but it felt secondary, almost mundane, compared to the silent, patient awareness of the machines around us. Every vibration, every mechanical sigh, every pulse of light reminded me of the rule we had just honored. I knew that even in obedience, we were not safe, only deferred. The control hub's panel was alive in my memory, and I couldn't shake the sense that it had been observing us, recording every micro movement, every hesitation. Jensen avoided looking at me, but I sensed his unease, the flicker of doubt in his eyes about the rules we were forced to follow. I didn't speak. Words were useless here. Only caution could survive. The stairwell ended at the maintenance deck, where tools were scattered from the day's work, yet nothing moved. I forced myself to take deep breaths, feeling the air shift slightly as the turbines far above continued their rhythmic pulse. I could almost hear the faint echo of the panel's display in my mind, the symbol that had appeared for only a fraction of a second, lingering in the space between thought and perception. My heart raced not from fatigue, but from the certainty that one misstep, one touch, would change everything. Obedience to Rule 2 was my only armor against whatever force had awakened that turbine, and yet I knew that armor was fragile, paper-thin, and already tested to its limit. We walked silently toward the next section of the rig, each footstep measured, the sound of metal on metal, exaggerated in the quiet. The turbine's presence remained in the back of my mind, a low hum that resonated inside my skull, rather than the floor. I could feel the energy of the machines, the awareness that stretched through every girder, cable, and pipe. Rule 2 was more than a guideline, it was a lifeline, and breaking it even in thought could have consequences. I kept glancing at Jensen, making sure he hadn't succumbed to the same curiosity that nearly trapped me in the turbine room. His silence confirmed it. For now we were safe, but only because we remembered. And just as we reached the junction to the next section, I felt it, a subtle shift in the metal beneath our feet, a vibration that wasn't from the storm. My stomach twisted. I knew this was a reminder that Rule 2 existed for reasons beyond comprehension, and that obeying it was only a temporary reprieve. Something else was already watching, waiting for the next opportunity. I had barely caught my breath from the tension of the control hub when the thought of Rule 3, never enter the turbine room alone after midnight, even if you hear familiar voices, hit me like a punch to the chest. The memory of the turbine's self-starting hum still lingered, vibrating under my skin. And yet, As I walked the narrow catwalk toward the observation deck, I could have sworn I heard Jensen calling my name from inside the engine room. My pulse spiked. The sound was unmistakable, but the moment I paused, the echo didn't match the rhythm of our own movements. It was off, almost warped, dragging in a subtle, sinister way. I told myself it must be the acoustics, the way the storm made the rig sing, but the instinctual warning of Rule 3 refused to leave me alone. Every step felt heavier, weighed down by the possibility of unseen eyes tracking me. The catwalk stretched endlessly, or so it seemed, shadows twisting into irregular angles with every flicker of the dim overhead lights. I gripped the rail, my knuckles white, knowing the vibration of the rig under my boots could easily mask something moving alongside me. That voice, or something mimicking it, called again, clearer this time, and I froze. My stomach churned, and my mind raced through every protocol, every whispered caution from veteran mechanics I had once mocked. "You'll see things out here that aren't supposed to exist," they'd said. I had laughed, but the rig was no longer a familiar metal shell. It was a living, breathing labyrinth designed to test my compliance, patience, and fear. Every instinct screamed to ignore the voice, yet part of me ached to see who or what was calling. I paused halfway across the catwalk and remembered the emergency hatch leading to the turbine mezzanine. One wrong turn, and I could be trapped in a room full of machines that didn't forgive mistakes. I glanced over the edge at the swaying pipes below, the faint green glow of warning lights reflecting on the storm-slicked metal, and felt the rig's awareness pressing against my skin. The turbine's low hum had returned, subtle but undeniable, and it seemed synchronized with the call that beckoned me. I stepped back, telling myself that obeying Rule 3 meant leaving the voice unanswered, even if it was Jensen. My ears strained for his next words, and my mind refused to accept the reality that the voice could belong to something else entirely, something that had learned to sound human. The air shifted as I approached the observation deck entrance, a sudden chill crawling up my spine. I remembered the stories about engineers disappearing, called in to fix alarms or turbines at midnight, never seen again. The rig's internal logic seemed alive, calculating, rewarding obedience and punishing curiosity. I gripped my flashlight tighter, sweeping the beam toward the turbine room below. There it was, the faint orange glow from the panel, now dimmer than before, but still pulsing like a heartbeat. I wanted to look away, to step into the hall that led to safer sections of the rig, but my attention kept snapping back to the glow, to the distant voice echoing my name. I told myself one last time, the rule existed for a reason. I could not, under any circumstance, cross that threshold alone. I tried to convince Jensen to follow me back to the lower decks, speaking in quick whispers over the vibrating catwalk. "We should go back," I said. "The turbine room. It's not safe tonight." But he hesitated, peering into the darkened corridor, drawn toward the voice as if compelled by some force stronger than reason. His shadow flickered against the walls, elongated and distorted, almost reaching for the unseen presence ahead. I thought I heard something," he admitted, his voice trembling. I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to grab him, to drag him back forcibly. The rig demanded obedience not just from individuals but from the crew collectively, and the thought of Jensen breaking Rule 3 filled me with a cold dread I could barely tolerate. One wrong step, and the turbine room would claim its next victim. The stairwell leading down hummed faintly, a distant resonance from the machinery below, and every vibration told me the turbine remembered my previous encounter. It wasn't mechanical memory, it was something else, something aware. I took a deep breath, focusing on the metal beneath my boots, the cold smell of ozone lingering in the air. The voice whispered again, but this time it changed, softer, slower, almost pleading. It mirrored my own thoughts, preying on the slightest cracks in my resolve. I swallowed hard, repeating the rules silently like a mantra. Never enter the turbine room alone after midnight, even if you hear familiar voices. The words acted as a tether, holding me to sanity while the rig attempted to pull me towards something incomprehensible. Jensen finally took a step back, his gaze still fixed on the corridor. Relief surged briefly, tempered immediately by the realization that we were both on edge, trapped in a web of our own fear. I scanned the observation deck, noting every access panel, every pipe, every shadow, trying to predict what might move first. The turbine's glow pulsed again, almost intentionally, drawing my attention despite my resistance. The rig seemed to breathe around us, mechanical lungs inhaling and exhaling in synchrony with the storm outside. My mind flitted to the stories of turbines spontaneously activating after midnight, and I realized that the legends weren't exaggerations. They were warnings. Warnings embedded in Rule 3, guiding me with a precision born of experience I had yet to fully grasp. A subtle vibration ran up the walls, and I noticed a faint reflection in the glass of the observation deck, a figure standing just outside the turbine room. I froze. Its features were obscured, shifting like smoke, yet its stance mimicked mine. I knew instinctively that stepping closer would violate the rule, would provoke a response, but the figure's familiarity tugged at my thoughts. Was it Jensen? A hallucination? Something else entirely? I couldn't tell, and fear tightened its grip, reminding me why Rule 3 existed. One wrong move, and the turbines wouldn't just hum, they would act, and whatever was behind that mechanical pulse would know. I inched away from the observation window, trying to remain calm, noting every minute detail, the shifting shadows, the pulsing glow, the low, deliberate vibration that traveled through the metal grates. The rig seemed to anticipate my movements, responding subtly to my every hesitation. I whispered to myself, reminding myself that obeying the rule was the only chance to survive, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the turbine room was alive in more ways than one. My mind tried to rationalize, attributing the voice and the figure to storm acoustics and fatigue, but I knew deep down that was a lie. The rules weren't arbitrary, they were protective, shaped by experience, necessity, and survival instincts honed over decades of night shifts on the North Sea rig. A sudden clatter echoed faintly from the lower deck, and my heart leapt. I could feel the rig reacting, almost like it was aware we were discussing the turbine room in hushed tones. The vibration beneath my boots increased slightly, synchronized with a new subtle hum that hadn't been there before. Jensen flinched beside me, glancing toward the staircase leading down. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, the thin beam trembling slightly in my hand. I whispered again, "Do not enter. Not alone. Midnight is no friend to curiosity. Rule 3 isn't a suggestion, it's a lifeline." I would not break it tonight, not even for a voice that sounded like someone I trusted. We stood there, frozen, listening to the low rhythmic pulse emanating from the turbines below. The storm outside intensified, waves battering the rig, but I knew the real danger was inside, alive in the steel, cables, and shadows. The voice called once more, soft, familiar, pleading, but I resisted. One step toward the turbine room, and everything could change, unravel in a way I couldn't survive. Rule 3 wasn't just guidance, it was a boundary separating awareness from catastrophe, a thin line I was determined not to cross. And even as the rig groaned around us, vibrating subtly as if testing our resolve, I knew that obeying this rule tonight was only the first of many trials yet to come. The hallway leading away from the observation deck felt narrower than it had ever been, as if the shadows themselves had leaned in closer to watch my every step, reminding me of Rule 4, always keep at least one hand on a stable surface when moving near operational machinery at night. I ran my hand along the cold metal railing, feeling the vibration under my fingertips, every hum and pulse echoing like a heartbeat through my bones. The rig seemed almost sentient, every pipe and cable humming with awareness, reacting to my presence. My other hand clenched around the flashlight, its thin beam dancing nervously across the grating beneath me. I could feel my pulse rising in tandem with the faint tremors beneath my boots. Each step a careful negotiation between survival and curiosity. I remembered the first night I had almost ignored this rule, brushing past a spinning shaft too quickly, and realizing, just in time, that the vibration had shifted in response to me. That memory surged now, a warning that my inattention could cost me everything. The metal beneath my fingertips was warm in patches, where machinery vibrated slightly more intensely, subtle signals that something below was alive and aware. I kept my hand firmly on the railing, forcing myself to move slowly, deliberately, each step a conscious act of obedience. Every shadow seemed to twitch and pulse in tandem with the turbines far below, and I realized the rig's machines were watching, learning, waiting for any lapse in discipline. My muscles tensed with every careful movement, a combination of fear and awareness guiding me forward. The corridor twisted, lined with access panels and conduits that hummed faintly, transmitting vibrations from engines I could not see. A distant clatter sounded from the turbine room, far enough that it might have been a loose tool or something else entirely, but it made me tighten my grip on the railing. I thought of Jensen behind me, probably trying to follow silently, and I silently admonished him not to falter. The rule wasn't just for me, it was for anyone moving near machinery at night. One misstep, one moment of overconfidence, and the vibration could shift in a way that would make a hand slip, a foot falter, a life end. I could almost feel the machines anticipating weakness, sending subtle tremors along the metal to test my concentration. As we approached the junction to the maintenance stairs, a low vibration ran along the wall, higher pitched than the general hum beneath our feet. My fingers pressed firmly against the railing, tracing its subtle ridges as though they were lifelines. I whispered to Jensen to stay close and keep one hand on the wall as well, repeating the mantra silently in my head. Rule 4. The storm outside made the rig shake in time with the waves, but the vibrations beneath my hands were independent, precise, deliberate. They weren't caused by wind or water, they were internal, mechanical, and impossibly aware. Each pulse reminded me that machinery wasn't inert tonight, and that it could respond to my slightest movement with consequences I was not prepared to face. I glanced at the ladder leading up to the service platforms and noticed faint shadows flickering against the grating, elongated and twitching unnaturally with every passing second. My grip on the railing tightened reflexively, the vibration searing through my palm in short, sharp bursts. It was as if the rig was speaking in a language of tremors and hums, translating intention into movement. My flashlight beam wavered, and I caught a reflection in a polished pipe, a figure behind me that I couldn't identify. I froze, remembering the warning embedded in Rule 4, that even a second's distraction could be fatal. The figure didn't move, yet the vibration shifted subtly, as though aware of my attention. I forced myself to step past the reflection carefully, avoiding any sudden motions that might trigger a response from the machinery. The lower deck stretched ahead, a corridor lined with vents and piping that vibrated at different frequencies, creating a complex symphony of tension that seemed to reach inside my chest. I kept one hand on the grating along the side wall, tracing its cool, textured surface to anchor myself as my other hand gripped the flashlight tightly. Every pulse felt like a test, each hum a question: would I falter? Would I step incorrectly? The rig seemed to read my intentions before I even formulated them, and my heart pounded with the knowledge that one slip could awaken more than just machinery. It could awaken what waited beyond the humming metal, something older, patient, and aware of every rule I had been taught. Jensen's voice broke the silence, low and hesitant, asking if the vibrations were normal. I shook my head slightly, warning him without speaking too loudly. "Just keep your hand on the wall," I muttered, and he obeyed, pressing his palm firmly against the cool surface beside him. The rig seemed to recognize the compliance, the shared adherence to the rule, and the vibrations stabilized for a moment, almost as if acknowledging our obedience. But I knew that this was temporary. The machinery didn't forgive mistakes. It measured, it waited, and the storm outside was irrelevant compared to the awareness inside. My hand followed every contour of the railing instinctively, tracing its shape with unbroken focus, refusing to let curiosity overtake caution. A sudden metallic groan echoed from deep within the hull, vibrating the floor through our boots. My grip tightened, the pulse in the railing matching the unexpected tremor, as though the rig was testing my reflexes. I felt the tiniest misalignment in the metal under my fingers, a subtle warning that something had shifted, perhaps a misaligned shaft, perhaps a response from the awakened turbines above. My eyes darted toward the nearest service panel, noting the soft glow of indicators, and I resisted every urge to touch it, to investigate. Rule 4 pulsed in my mind. Keeping a hand on a stable surface wasn't just precaution, it was protection. A tether between survival and catastrophe. The corridor ended at a maintenance hatch, leading toward a section of the rig rarely used after dark. I pressed my hand against the cold steel edge of the hatch, feeling the vibration run along my arm, a warning, a communication I couldn't interpret. The dim overhead lights made the shadows twist and stretch in ways that seemed unnatural, elongating the dark corners into shapes I could not ignore. I whispered for Jensen to stay close and check his footing, noting how every step echoed like a question in a cathedral of metal. The rig's pulse seemed to follow us, subtle and precise, mapping our movements, guiding our choices. My hand on the railing was more than support. It was my line of defense against the unpredictable intelligence that had awakened in the machinery above. I could hear the turbines humming far above, a low, controlled murmur that seemed to resonate through every pipe and cable in the hull. The vibrations beneath us rose slightly, syncopated with the turbine's rhythm, and I realized the rule wasn't just about preventing slips, it was about maintaining awareness, preserving balance in a rig that no longer followed conventional rules. My fingers traced the texture of the railing, memorizing its bumps, its welds, as though each irregularity could give me a clue to the unseen forces around me. I whispered Rule 4 to myself again, a quiet reminder, not only to stay safe, but to keep my mind anchored to reality in a place that was trying to bend it. As we reached the end of the hallway, the lights flickered, and a sudden surge of vibration ran up the metal grating, strong enough to make me pause and tighten my grip. The rig's machinery seemed to be responding to something we hadn't done yet, anticipating a movement we had not yet made. I swallowed hard, heart hammering, knowing that the rules were cumulative. Breaking one could cascade into disaster, and even adherence could feel like a trial. My hand remained firmly planted, the other tight around my flashlight, every sense alert, every muscle coiled in tension. I forced myself to take deliberate, measured steps toward the next section, knowing that the turbines, the vibrations, and the hidden awareness inside the rig were all waiting to test our obedience once again. And just as I reached the ladder leading to the service platforms, a subtle shift in vibration made my stomach clench, reminding me that Rule 4 existed for a reason, and that the rig was watching, patient, calculating, waiting for the next mistake. The service platform was colder than the hallway behind us, the metal beneath my gloves vibrating with a dull rhythm that reminded me of Rule 5. If a machine stops suddenly while you're near it, do not touch it for at least 30 seconds. As I stepped onto the graded walkway, my flashlight beam trembled across the pipes below, reflecting off the thin layer of moisture that clung to the metal like sweat. The storm outside continued to shake the rig, but the vibrations beneath my boots were different, controlled, patterned, almost intentional. I could feel Jensen lingering close behind me, his breathing shallow, both of us knowing we were entering one of the most unpredictable parts of the entire structure. One wrong move here, and the rig wouldn't forgive us. The machinery in this section always sounded uneven at night, but tonight the imbalance felt purposeful, like the machines were adjusting themselves in response to our presence. I could see the faint green glow of the indicator lights scattered along the corridor, each one pulsing with a subtle rhythm that didn't match any operational cycle I recognized. The pipes along the wall thrummed softly, yet their cadence shifted every time we stepped forward, almost as if they were listening. Jensen asked quietly if everything was functioning normally, but the hesitation in his voice made it clear he already knew the answer. I nodded toward a compressor ahead, its steady vibration unsettlingly out of sync with the rest of the machinery around it, and the unease in my chest deepened. We approached the compressor slowly, keeping one hand on the railing as the rule before had taught us, though now my awareness was centered on the possibility of sudden silence. The compressor's rhythmic tremor pulsed through the metal grate beneath us, steady at first, then subtly irregular as we drew near. I felt the shift before I heard it, a sudden change in vibration, a pulse too strong, followed by an unnatural stillness. The machine didn't ease into a shutdown, its entire presence simply ceased, like a breath cut short. Jensen froze behind me, and I instinctively pulled my hand away, stepping back to maintain distance. The air around the machine seemed to thicken, and the silence that replaced the vibration felt heavier than the storm rumbling outside. I counted silently in my head, fighting the urge to inspect the machine, to press my hand against it and feel for heat or life. Every instinct as a mechanic begged me to check for a fault, a jam, a safety trip, something normal, something rational. But the rule existed for a reason, and we both knew what happened to people who ignored it. 30 seconds wasn't long, but in that moment it felt like an eternity, each second stretching into something sharp and suffocating, as my heartbeat filled the void where the machine's hum should have been. I watched the indicator light next to the compressor flicker uncertainly, as though struggling to decide whether it was still connected to anything at all. Jensen whispered my name, his voice trembling, as he asked if we should back away, but I held up a hand, reminding him silently that movement could trigger something worse. The rig's interior had rules, rhythms, and unseen reactions we barely understood. The second-hand ticking of time in my mind felt painfully slow, and I found myself gripping the railing harder to keep from pacing. I studied the compressor, noting the faint condensation on its pipes, the uneven gleam of its casing under my flashlight, and the subtle shadow behind it that hadn't been there a moment ago. I swallowed hard, forcing myself not to step closer. If the machine had stopped, then something had triggered it, and that something was still nearby. The seconds finally completed in my head, and only then did I inch forward to inspect the compressor. I kept my hands close to my body, avoiding any direct contact with the metal as I leaned in to check the gauges. The pressure levels were strangely normal, no sign of overheat or malfunction, no indication that the machine had reason to stop at all. Yet the pipes beside it vibrated faintly, as if responding to a force deeper within the rig. Jensen stayed behind me, shifting anxiously, his flashlight trembling in his grip as he scanned the shadows around us. The air carried a faint metallic tang, sharper than usual, almost like the smell left behind after electrical discharge. I had never known the compressor to behave like this, and the stillness around it felt wrong, like something unseen had placed its hand upon it and commanded silence. I straightened slowly, listening to the faint, uneven vibrations in the walls, each one seeming to pulse with an undercurrent of anticipation. The storm outside made the entire rig sway subtly, the ocean's weight pressing against the structure with rhythmic force, but the mechanical silence here felt isolated from all of that. I told Jensen quietly that we needed to move, that this section of the rig was no longer predictable tonight. He nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the compressor, as though waiting for it to move again on its own. The idea made my skin crawl, and I could feel the rig's tension pressing against my awareness, urging us to leave before something else shifted unexpectedly. As we stepped back toward the walkway, a faint vibration passed under us, weak but distinct, like a heartbeat returning after being forcibly stopped. I turned to see the compressor shudder slightly, its casing trembling, as though waking from a trance. The indicator light flickered twice, then stabilized, glowing steadily, as though nothing had happened. But I knew the truth. Machines did not behave like that, not without reason, not without awareness. Jensen asked if we should report the anomaly immediately, and I hesitated, unsure how to explain an event that defied both procedure and logic. I nodded, though my confidence wavered, knowing that some of the older crew would simply tell us we had finally begun noticing what they had warned us about. We continued along the walkway, both of us hyper-aware of the machinery surrounding us. The hums and vibrations blended together in a strange harmony, but now every slight fluctuation felt deliberate, as though the rig was adjusting itself around our presence. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting another compressor or generator to fall silent as we passed. The storm outside intensified, making the metal around us shift subtly, but the internal machinery seemed unaffected, focused instead on our movements, judging our obedience to rules we still didn't fully understand. My hand tightened on the railing again, though the next rule hadn't yet demanded it, and I found myself breathing shallowly as we reached the final stretch of the platform. The corridor beyond the platform was darker than the rest of the rig, lit only by a few dim emergency lights spaced too far apart. The hum here was deeper, slower, resonating through the floor in long pulses that felt like the heartbeat of something enormous beneath us. Jensen hesitated before stepping forward, glancing back at me as though seeking permission. I motioned for him to stay close, and we moved together into the dimly lit passage. The shadows here clung to the walls like living things, thick and still, and every vibration underfoot felt calculated, responding to our proximity with unsettling precision. I whispered for him to stay alert, knowing that the rig was far from finished with us tonight. As we reached the midpoint of the corridor, another machine deep within the wall let out a long, low shudder, and for a brief second, everything around us went completely still. The hums, the pulses, the subtle vibrations, all gone in an instant. My breath caught as I realized we were standing beside one of the primary conduit lines, a system that should never fall silent under any circumstance. Jensen instinctively reached toward the conduit, but I grabbed his arm sharply, reminding him silently that touching anything during this unnatural stillness could be the last mistake he ever made. He froze, eyes wide with fear as he realized how close he had come to breaking the rule. The silence lasted exactly long enough to make my skin crawl before a faint, distant vibration returned, traveling through the metal beneath our boots like a slow exhale. I let go of Jensen's arm, and we both took a step back, giving the conduit the space it demanded. The emergency lights flickered faintly as the hum slowly resumed, but the rhythm was off, slightly staggered, like a machine imitating life. I whispered that we needed to reach the monitoring station as soon as possible, hoping that the systems there would give us some explanation. But deep down I knew the rig was no longer following any pattern that its designers had intended. Something else was shaping its movements now. We walked silently for the next stretch, every step measured, every breath quiet, until the corridor finally opened into the narrow chamber, leading to the central monitoring hub. The moment we stepped toward it, a sudden shift in the vibrations around us made me freeze entirely. The walls seemed to pulse inward, the air thick with static, and for the first time tonight, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being observed, not by a person, but by the machinery itself. The compressor incident had not been an isolated occurrence. It had been the first sign, and as the corridor seemed to breathe around us, I realized we weren't just obeying rules to avoid danger. We were obeying them because something on the rig was testing us, and as the vibrations rose, slow and deliberate, I knew the test wasn't over yet. I paused at the threshold of the narrow maintenance corridor, feeling the weight of Rule 6. Never enter a compartment marked restricted at night, regardless of who calls you, and pressing into my chest. The metal door before me bore the familiar red warning label, its letters fading but still menacing in the dim emergency lighting. The vibrations beneath my boots were subtle but deliberate, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed almost aware of my hesitation. I could hear the storm outside hammering the rig's structure, waves slamming against the pillars, but inside a quieter, more insidious presence demanded my attention. Jensen hovered behind me, flashlight shaking slightly in his grip, as though sensing the same tension that had made my chest tight. I remembered the countless warnings whispered by veterans on the rig, stories of men called into restricted compartments at night and never seen again. Their voices had always sounded reasonable, almost casual when recounting the incidents, a flicker in the lights, a strange hum in the walls, someone lured by curiosity. I had once scoffed at the tales, attributing them to superstition and the harsh monotony of offshore life. But the events of the past hours had dismantled every ounce of my skepticism. The red door before us was more than a warning. It was a barrier between our survival and catastrophe. I traced the metal frame with one hand, feeling the faint thrum of vibration as though the rig itself was testing my resolve. Suddenly a voice echoed faintly from the compartment beyond the door, familiar yet warped, calling my name. Jensen stiffened beside me. My instinct screamed to ignore it, to walk away immediately, but curiosity clawed at the edges of my mind. I whispered to him, "It doesn't matter who's calling. We do not go in, not tonight." The voice shifted subtly, imitating tones and inflections we knew too well, creating the chilling illusion that someone we trusted stood beyond that threshold. The rig seemed to pulse in response to our hesitation, the vibrations beneath us intensifying slightly, a reminder that obedience was survival, and deviation could be fatal. Every instinct told me to stay rooted, to respect the invisible boundary, but the fear of missing something, of failing to act, gnawed at my nerves. We lingered, both aware of the unnatural stillness in the air near the door. The faint green glow from nearby indicator lights danced across the metal surfaces, casting elongated shadows that crept along the corridor like living creatures. Jensen whispered again, asking what was inside. I shook my head slowly, reminding him silently that Rule 6 existed to prevent calamity. Even the smallest mistake here could trigger consequences beyond comprehension. The vibrations beneath our feet shifted unpredictably, subtle enough that we could have mistaken them for normal structural resonance, but I knew better. The rig was alive in its own way, testing every rule, every boundary, waiting for the moment someone would falter. As we moved along the corridor to gain a better vantage point, I caught sight of the access panel beside the restricted door. Its lights flickered erratically, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed responsive to our presence. The storm outside had reached a peak, making the entire rig sway, but the vibrations near the door were separate, intentional, controlled, and measured. I realized with a chill that the machinery and structures were anticipating our choices, almost as if they were sentient observers. Jensen's footsteps faltered, and I reached to steady him, silently commanding him to remember the rule. One step too far, one hand touching that door, and whatever waited inside could be unleashed with no warning, no mercy. The familiar tang of metal and ozone filled the corridor, stronger near the restricted compartment, and I swallowed hard, resisting the urge to peer through the tiny inspection window. The storm's light flashed intermittently through the rig's portholes, illuminating the warning sign in brief, almost cinematic bursts. The vibrations underfoot became increasingly erratic, pulsing like a heartbeat out of sync with the storm, reminding me that the machinery itself seemed alive, aware of our fear. I whispered to Jensen again, "Do not go near it, no matter what you hear." He nodded, pale and tense, gripping my arm as if it were the only tether keeping him from stepping forward. The rig was testing us, daring us to break the rule that had been written to protect not just life, but sanity. A sudden clattering echoed faintly from somewhere deeper in the compartment, followed by the distorted echo of the voice calling my name. I froze, my pulse racing, knowing the rig had engineered every sound to tempt us, to provoke an instinctual response. The metal beneath our feet vibrated slightly more intensely, a rhythm that made my spine tingle. I forced myself to take slow, deliberate breaths, forcing my mind to obey the rational caution Rule 6 demanded. One moment of hesitation or curiosity could allow the compartment's hidden forces to act, and I could not afford to underestimate the rig's sentience any longer. The vibrations beneath the grated floorboards acted as a silent countdown, warning us that patience was as essential as movement. We edged toward the junction to the next corridor, keeping a careful distance from the restricted door. I could feel the structure's subtle shift, as if it were subtly urging me back, a barely perceptible nudge toward safety. Jensen whispered that he could hear footsteps inside the compartment, though we both knew the likelihood of human presence was nil. Still, the rig had a way of making illusions feel real, manipulating shadows, vibrations, and sounds into forms our minds could not easily dismiss. I reminded myself that obedience to Rule 6 was not optional. The lives of those who had broken it were whispered warnings etched into the metal beams of the rig, tales of vanishing and horror we had no intention of joining. The corridor stretched on, dim and twisting, and I kept my hand firmly pressed against the metal wall, a conscious habit reinforced by the previous rule. Every vibration along the wall, every flicker of light, felt like a test, an opportunity for the machinery to judge our compliance. I could feel Jensen trembling beside me, and I whispered reassurance, though my own nerves were taut as strings. The storm outside lashed against the rig's pillars, the vibrations of the waves traveling in tandem with the internal pulse of machinery, creating a disorienting mix of natural and mechanical rhythm. I focused on the rules, repeating them silently, as though each repetition might reinforce our tether to survival. Rule 6 was alive in my mind, a lifeline we could cling to. As we rounded the next bend, the distant vibration of turbines and compressors seemed to converge, sending a low, resonant pulse through the grating beneath us. The restricted compartment's door loomed behind, shadowed and silent, yet somehow louder than any sound the storm could produce. I felt an invisible weight pressing on my chest, urging me to step forward, to see, to discover, yet every fiber of my being resisted. I reminded myself once more that the rule existed for a reason far beyond human understanding, that obeying it could mean the difference between returning to the living and being lost to the machinery's will. Jensen flinched as the pulse intensified, and I squeezed his shoulder subtly, silently conveying that patience was the only option. The corridor ended at the junction to the service stairwell, and I felt a faint tremor running along the railing as I gripped it. My flashlight beam swung slowly across the corridor, illuminating the grating, pipes, and shadows cast by the storm's intermittent flashes. The restricted compartment door seemed impossibly still, yet somehow aware, like it was waiting for a breach. I reminded myself silently, one last time, of Rule 6, the weight of every lost crew member pressing heavily in my mind. The rig was patient, and it would not act hastily, but neither would it forgive curiosity. As we descended the stairwell toward the lower decks, the vibrations beneath our feet shifted once more, slow, deliberate, as though acknowledging our compliance. Yet a small part of my mind remained alert, uneasy, aware that the restricted compartment had not been ignored entirely by whatever force lingered in the rig's metal and machinery. I knew the night was far from over, and obeying the rule tonight had only postponed what was to come. Every instinct told me the next test was approaching, and that whatever waited beyond obeyed no conventional logic, only the rules. And just as we reached the bottom landing, I felt the faintest, almost imperceptible pulse from the restricted compartment, a warning, a reminder, and a promise that our obedience had been noted. The stairwell vibrated under my boots as we descended, and the hum of the rig's systems echoed faintly through the metal. I kept repeating Rule 7. If the rig goes completely silent, you have 30 seconds to reach a lit area in my mind, knowing that silence on a structure this massive was never natural and never safe. Jensen walked slightly ahead, his flashlight beam trembling across the grated steps, casting shadows that twisted with the swaying motion of the rig. I felt the tension in the air shift, as the storm outside continued hammering the steel pillars, making the railings tremble under my grip. Every sound seemed louder, because I was listening for the absence of all of them, the one warning sign that could kill us faster than any machine. The farther we moved along the lower deck corridor, the more the vibrations changed, becoming uneven and unpredictable, like an arrhythmic pulse echoing through the metal. I could hear the storm, the distant churn of turbines, and the low rumble of pumps working overtime to stabilize the rig. Yet a part of me was hyper-aware that all of this noise could vanish without warning. Jensen muttered something under his breath, but the wind howling against the rig swallowed his words before they reached me. My flashlight flickered once, almost teasingly, and the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of us, lined with pipes that hummed in uneven patterns. as if they too sensed what might happen next. The air felt charged, the kind of heavy pressure that told you something was coming. As we moved past the junction leading to the auxiliary generator room, I noticed the flickering lights above us dying for a moment before recovering, a warning pulse that sent a jolt through my chest. Jensen slowed, glancing at me for a moment, uncertainty etched across his face. He didn't ask the question I knew he wanted to ask, but his silence was heavy with fear. The rig felt different today, almost conscious of our movements, adjusting itself around us with the precision of a predator watching its prey. I whispered for him to keep moving, faster than before, knowing we needed to reach a stable zone before anything changed again. The metal beneath our boots groaned softly, a long drawn-out vibration that felt less like machinery and more like a breath. We passed the row of storage lockers and emergency cabinets, their doors rattling slightly from the storm's assault. My light slid across the walls, revealing subtle cracks in the paint, rust creeping along the bolts, and faint stains that had never truly been explained. The air smelled of salt water and hot metal, a sharp combination that made the back of my throat sting. I halted suddenly when I noticed the shadows ahead behaving strangely, shifting not with the rhythm of the lights, but with something unseen. Jensen noticed too, his posture tightening as he gripped the strap of his utility bag. I motioned for him to stay close, my instincts screaming that the rig was preparing to test Rule 7, and that we needed to pay attention to every detail. A soft tremor shook the corridor, making the overhead pipes rattle slightly. I felt the temperature drop by a few degrees. A coldness creeping through the metal walls like a warning seeped into every seam. Jensen whispered nervously, asking if I felt it too, and I nodded silently. The hum of the generator faltered again, dropping into a stuttering rhythm before stabilizing. The lights flickered overhead, casting brief flashes that distorted the shadows around us into grotesque shapes. I could sense the rig anticipating our movements, calculating where we would go and how quickly we could reach safety if the silence hit. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, feeling the tension coil in my stomach like a taut wire. We rounded another corner, and suddenly the lights grew dimmer, reducing the corridor to a murky tunnel of shifting shapes. The pipes overhead vibrated irregularly, creating a low resonance that moved through the walls like a pulse. Jensen stepped closer to me without speaking, both of us instinctively expecting the next phase of the test. My heartbeat hammered against my ribs, not from fear of the dark, but from the knowledge that the rig enjoyed cutting noise without warning. Every time silence hit, it felt intentional, like the rig wanted to see how fast you moved, how desperate you became, how terrified you could be before the 30 seconds ran out. I swallowed hard, bracing myself for the moment we had trained for but hoped to avoid. We reached a split in the corridor, one path leading toward the workshop, its lights flickering erratically, and the other toward the lower engine bay, currently engulfed in shadow. I didn't hesitate. I pushed Jensen toward the workshop direction, knowing we stood a better chance there if the silence dropped suddenly. The storm outside intensified, slamming against the rig with bursts of force that made the entire structure shudder. My chest tightened as I listened intently to every hum, every vibration, every faint mechanical pulse. The workshop wasn't far, but the corridor felt longer with each step, the walls closing inward as though the rig itself wanted to steal our sense of distance. Then it happened. Every sound disappeared, not faded, not softened, disappeared. No storm, no turbines, no pumps, not even the subtle vibrations under my boots. Absolute suffocating silence. Jensen's eyes widened, and I grabbed his arm, shoving him forward as we sprinted toward the workshop's glow at the end of the corridor. My boots pounded against the metal grating, each step a desperate race against time, though I couldn't even hear my own footsteps. The world felt hollow, like sound had been vacuumed out of existence. My lungs burned as I forced myself to move faster, dragging Jensen along when his pace faltered. The silence clung to us, heavy and oppressive, as though the rig itself had become a void that wanted to swallow us whole. The lights ahead flickered violently, the glow shrinking as we approached, threatening to vanish completely. Panic surged through me as the hallway warped in the faint strobing illumination, distorting the corners and stretching the shadows into impossible shapes. Jensen gasped silently beside me, his face pale with terror. The workshop door felt miles away, the lit area shrinking with every second we lost. The silence pressed against my eardrums like a physical force, making my vision flicker at the edges. I clenched my jaw and pushed myself harder, feeling the cold air thicken around us. We made it to the workshop door just as the lights inside dipped dangerously low. I shoved Jensen through the threshold, stumbling in behind him as a faint hum returned to the rig, breaking the silence like a gasp of air after nearly drowning. My knees hit the floor, breath ragged, my chest heaving as the sounds of turbines, pumps, and storms slowly resumed around us. Jensen slid down against the wall, trembling uncontrollably, his eyes fixed on the doorway behind us as though expecting the silence to chase us in. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stand despite the shaking in my legs. But before I could speak, the lights inside the workshop flickered once more. Only this time, something moved behind the rows of machinery, something that hadn't been there before the silence fell. The workshop air felt heavier than the corridor, thicker somehow, as if the rig itself had drawn it in to press against us. I could feel the metallic taste of moisture and salt hanging in every breath, a reminder that Rule 8, never remove your helmet in any area below deck, without explicit clearance, was more than protocol. It was survival. I tightened the straps on mine reflexively, the visor fogging slightly from my rapid breathing, and glanced at Jensen, whose hand lingered near his own helmet as though he wanted reassurance. The flickering light cast strange, elongated shadows across the machinery, and every corner seemed to stretch unnaturally, hiding shapes we couldn't quite identify. My chest tightened with anticipation, and I felt the eerie weight of the rig's presence pressing in, waiting for even the smallest lapse. We moved cautiously between the rows of machinery, aware that below deck, nothing was predictable anymore. The vibrations beneath our boots were subtle but insistent, running along the grating in irregular pulses that felt almost deliberate. The storm outside made the rig sway, but the internal shifts were different, patterned in a way that made me instinctively trace the metal handrails whenever I could. Jensen whispered that he thought he saw movement near the ventilation shafts, and I nodded, silently agreeing but saying nothing aloud. The rig didn't need words. Its presence was tangible, and I could feel it measuring us, noting every misstep, testing our adherence to rules. The thought of removing my helmet even briefly made my stomach knot. The deeper we went, the more I noticed the condensation clinging to pipes and walls, distorting reflections and shadows. My flashlight illuminated glimpses of control panels that shouldn't have been active at this hour, lights blinking in patterns that made no sense. I reminded myself to maintain distance from all moving parts, keeping hands and feet deliberate in placement. Every vibration beneath the grating seemed to sync with my heartbeat, a sinister rhythm I couldn't escape. Jensen inched closer to me, muttering about the oppressive atmosphere, and I felt a chill pass through my gloves. The helmet wasn't just for air, it was a shield against whatever unseen presence had begun to weave through the rig below deck, a force that could manipulate the environment around us. We approached the lower junction near the main engine room, and the shadows seemed to shift faster than normal, as though propelled by some hidden motion beneath the metal plating. I could see the faint glow of indicator lights through the grating on the floor, and my chest tightened as the thought struck me that the rig's machinery might now be aware of our exact movements. The pulse underfoot grew slightly stronger, almost as if the metal itself was acknowledging our compliance with the rules. I kept reminding myself to maintain Rule 8, knowing that even a second's lapse removing the helmet for a breath, for a look, for curiosity, could be fatal. Jensen glanced at me, eyes wide, and I nodded, urging him to stay focused. As we turned toward the engine room's access corridor, the air grew warmer, metallic, and faintly acrid. Pipes throbbed in irregular patterns, and I noted how some of the machinery seemed to hum independently, vibrating in frequencies I couldn't identify. My visor fogged slightly from my rapid breathing, forcing me to take measured, careful breaths to avoid obscuring my vision. Every movement felt like it was under scrutiny, and I could sense the rig anticipating any mistake, any deviation from strict adherence to the rules. Jensen's hand hovered near a control panel, and I grabbed his wrist gently, pulling him back before he could reach it. Rule 8 had been clear below deck: no helmet removal, no exceptions, no curiosity. Even touching a panel without clearance could be a mistake that couldn't be undone. We continued down the corridor, flashlight beams cutting swaths of visibility through the thick shadows. The metal beneath our boots pulsed subtly, a vibration that almost felt like a heartbeat beneath the grated floor. I caught sight of a shadow moving against the wall, a shape too humanoid to be machinery, but too wrong to be human. Jensen froze beside me, and I whispered that he must keep moving, slow and steady, letting nothing distract him. The rig was testing our obedience, and the corridor ahead led directly to areas where the previous crew had vanished, swallowed by what lurked below deck. Each step was deliberate, each breath calculated, as we reminded ourselves of the invisible but relentless rules. Suddenly, the lights in the corridor flickered and dimmed, leaving only the faint glow from indicator panels on the walls. My heart raced. The rig's pulse beneath us changed in tone, slower, deliberate, as if it knew the lights had failed. I tightened the straps on my helmet instinctively, feeling the cold metal against my forehead and jaw, a reassuring tether to survival. Jensen whispered, panic in his voice, asking if we should go back, but I shook my head firmly. Once again, the rule was clear: do not remove the helmet. Below deck, every precaution mattered, and disobedience could lead to consequences we were not ready to witness. The vibrations ran through the floor, almost conversational in tone, hinting at awareness beyond machinery. We neared a junction that led to the engine bay proper. The corridor narrowed, the shadows deepening with each step. Pipes above us hummed and pulsed, some almost in unison, some at irregular intervals, creating a rhythm that made my skin crawl. I adjusted the flashlight in my glove, casting light over the surface of the walls and floor, noting tiny details: the slight warp in a metal plate, the condensation tracing along a seam, the reflection of a shadow that seemed just a little too wrong. I whispered to Jensen that we needed to stay steady, slow, deliberate. Each movement mattered, each breath mattered, and above all, the helmet had to stay on. Rule 8 wasn't just a precaution, it was a boundary between safety and the unknown. The corridor turned sharply, bringing us into an area where the metal was warmer beneath our hands. I noted this instinctively, the heat radiating from pipes that should have been cold. I could feel the rig subtly shifting, almost guiding us toward the engine room entrance. Jensen's voice caught in his throat, whispering something about a shape moving behind us. I didn't look back. I couldn't. One glance could be the mistake that would override every rule we had followed to survive. I gripped the railing tightly, every finger digging into the cold metal, steadying myself as the corridor seemed to narrow further, the walls closing in metaphorically, pressing us toward the unknown beyond the doorway. We finally reached the engine room hatch. The faint green glow of panels inside illuminated the edge of the corridor, and the air felt thick, oppressive. I paused, taking a measured breath, feeling the sweat bead under my gloves. The rig's vibrations beneath us pulsed faster, almost expectant, as though it had been waiting for us to reach this point. I glanced at Jensen, his face pale beneath the helmet visor, and nodded subtly, silently urging him to keep calm. Rule 8 was not negotiable, it was absolute. We had obeyed every previous rule, and now the helmet remained our tether to reality, the one shield between us and the incomprehensible presence that lingered below deck. As we opened the hatch and stepped into the engine room, the temperature rose, and the vibration pattern changed once again. The shadows cast by the machinery seemed alive, twisting and stretching unnaturally as our flashlight beams danced across them. I kept one hand on the nearest railing and moved deliberately toward the lit section of the room, silently counting the distance to the exit points. Every nerve in my body screamed that the rig's presence was more acute here than anywhere else. I whispered to Jensen that we had to stay together, remain calm, and above all obey Rule 8. Any lapse could unleash consequences beyond comprehension. And then, just as the far end of the engine room came into view, a shadow detached itself from the pipes above, a figure impossible to place, unmoving yet somehow aware. It froze our steps, making us realize that Rule 8 wasn't just about helmets, it was about survival itself. The engine room's heat pressed against my back as I carefully approached the access hatch leading to the submerged maintenance section, my hands instinctively brushing over the metal rail for balance. I reminded myself of Rule 9. Always check the pressure gauges twice before entering any submerged section, even though my eyes told me the readings had been stable only moments ago. Jensen followed silently, his gaze flicking nervously from the gauges to the dark water below, and I could feel his tension matching mine. The air here was thick with humidity, the faint scent of salt and metal filling every breath, reminding us of the ocean pressing against the hull. Every vibration beneath our boots was erratic, a subtle warning that we were not alone, and that the rig's awareness had shifted. I leaned over the first gauge, tracing the dial carefully with a gloved finger, noting the pressure reading. It was stable but seemed too perfect, almost artificial. Jensen shifted uneasily behind me, his hand brushing the metal conduit as though it might provide reassurance, but I knew it wouldn't. My flashlight beam trembled slightly in the reflection on the water below, revealing only distorted shadows of the pipes and supports lining the submerged section. Even though the numbers on the gauges appeared normal, I had learned to distrust appearances on this rig. Something about the last few hours had proven that even when the readings were calm, danger could be lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for a lapse in attention. I stepped closer to the secondary gauge, checking it methodically, comparing it to the first, knowing that consistency was vital here. The water beneath the grated floor rippled slightly, reacting to the vibrations of the structure above, but the irregularity made my stomach twist with unease. Jensen's whispered question about whether we were safe made me pause. His voice was small, almost swallowed by the oppressive environment. I forced myself to remain calm, repeating the rules silently as though the mantra could ward off whatever unseen force had claimed the rig. Every fiber of my being told me that the submerged section was unpredictable, that even the smallest misreading could spell disaster, and that Rule 9 existed for reasons far beyond basic safety protocol. The faint lights along the submerged corridor flickered, casting warped reflections that danced across the metal beams like living shadows. I double-checked the gauges once more, each hand movement precise, deliberate, refusing to let fear compromise judgment. Jensen's breathing had grown shallow, his body tense as he hovered close to the hatch, unwilling to step forward, yet unable to retreat. I whispered encouragement, reminding him that rules were our lifeline, our tether to survival, and that obedience, even in the face of mounting terror, was the only way forward. The rig's vibrations shifted beneath our boots, slow and irregular now, a silent reminder that it was watching, testing, measuring our caution. I stepped onto the graded walkway, leading into the submerged section, my eyes fixed on the gauges as I scanned the water below. The lighting was dim, the surface of the water reflecting shadows that shifted unnaturally. I reminded myself again, quietly, that Rule 9 was not negotiable. Even for a moment, failing to check the pressures could expose us to sudden flooding, structural collapse, or forces beyond comprehension. Jensen followed closely, gripping my shoulder lightly for reassurance as his eyes darted across the submerged section, noting the irregularities and reflections and the faint distortion of the pipes beneath the water. Every detail mattered, and the rig's almost sentient presence seemed to notice every hesitation, every faltering breath. As we moved further into the submerged area, the water below appeared darker, almost black, reflecting nothing except the faint flickering glow from the overhead lights. I kept one hand on the railing, guiding Jensen with me, while the other hovered near the next set of gauges. The metal underfoot vibrated subtly, pulsing in a way that was too deliberate to be natural. I reminded myself silently to double-check every dial, every indicator, every subtle fluctuation. The rig was unpredictable, and any lapse could allow the water to become more than a hazard. It could become a weapon, controlled by forces we didn't understand. Jensen's hand trembled slightly as he gripped the railing, and I whispered for him to stay calm, to trust the rules, to trust me. We rounded the corner, the submerged section narrowing as the pipes above us twisted in complex patterns, shadows elongating across the water's surface. The gauges ahead indicated slightly higher pressure than the first two we had checked, though still within nominal ranges. My mind raced as I noted the discrepancy, instinctively reading between the lines. Even minor fluctuations could signal danger here, and the rig's machinery seemed unusually tense, almost alive. Jensen's gaze shifted nervously from the gauges to the shadows, and I could feel him silently questioning whether we were safe. I forced a nod of reassurance, though my own gut churned with unease, knowing that adherence to Rule 9 was the only buffer between us and an unpredictable catastrophe. The corridor twisted again, bringing us closer to the submerged access doors leading deeper into the rig's lower sections. I paused to check the readings one final time, making sure to cross-reference every value. Even though the numbers were stable, there was an unnatural quality to their precision, as if the rig itself was holding them in check, waiting for us to let our guard down. Jensen whispered that he felt movement beneath the water, subtle ripples not caused by our own steps, and I didn't dismiss his words. The suspended quiet of the submerged section pressed in on us, oppressive and tangible, as if the very air and metal were conspiring to test our obedience to the rule. Every step forward felt deliberate, calculated, and necessary. I continued along the walkway, noting the dark shapes below the surface and the faint distortion caused by the water's reflection. The metal rail creaked under my hand, and the vibrations beneath our boots seemed to react to our pace. Each gauge I had checked felt like a tether, a lifeline that kept us connected to reality in this unnatural environment. I whispered once more to Jensen, urging caution, slow movement, and unerring focus on the instruments. The rig's pulse beneath us accelerated slightly, a reminder that the machinery was aware, almost sentient in its measurement of our compliance. Rule 9 was not merely protocol, it was a commandment of survival, and failure was unthinkable. As we approached the deeper section of the submerged area, the water below seemed to darken further, shadows thickening unnaturally. The gauges remained stable, yet the rig's vibrations pulsed in patterns that suggested it was testing something beyond the physical. Jensen froze momentarily, eyes wide, as a subtle distortion of the shadows caught his attention. I tightened my grip on the railing and whispered for him to stay calm, knowing the rig was responding to every emotion, every twitch, every hesitation. The final stretch to the next lit area felt endless, the corridor narrowing and twisting with impossible angles, but our focus remained on the gauges, as Rule 9 demanded. The rig watched, the water waited, and we moved, tethered by protocol. We reached a junction where the corridor split, one path leading to another flooded maintenance section, the other toward a stairwell with emergency lighting. I signaled Jensen toward the lit stairwell, our pace deliberate and steady. The shadowed water behind us rippled subtly, almost purposefully, and I felt a sudden chill run through my gloves. The gauges had been checked, twice as the rule required, yet the pressure reading on the farthest dial flickered ever so slightly, a whisper of something unseen. I reminded myself silently that we were adhering to the rule, and that it had saved lives countless times before. Still, the air felt thick, charged with anticipation, as if the rig had another trial awaiting. We moved toward the stairwell, shadows stretching behind us across the water's surface, each step echoing slightly in the cavernous metal chamber. The final glance at the gauges confirmed stable readings, and I exhaled slowly, though tension coiled in my chest. Jensen's hand remained close to the railing, tight, knuckled, trembling with a mixture of fear and relief. The water's black reflection seemed to pulse faintly, a reminder that the submerged section was not inert, it was aware. And as we stepped into the lit stairwell, I realized that Rule 9 had not only kept us alive, but had bought us a fragile reprieve in a rig that would not relent. But before we could fully ascend, a shadow detached from beneath the water, gliding silently along the corridor, leaving a wake of darkness that made every pulse of the rig feel threatening. The emergency stairwell reeked of salt, oil, and the lingering pressure of the storm outside, and I could feel the rig's subtle pulse through the metal beneath my boots. I whispered to Jensen the weight of Rule 10. Never attempt repairs on critical systems alone during a blackout, recalling how previous violations had ended in disappearances no one would ever fully explain. The dim emergency lights flickered as we descended toward the lower deck, casting elongated shadows across the walls and making the staircase appear longer than it should have been. My chest tightened as I imagined the consequences of ignoring the rule, picturing the machinery lurching violently in response to a solo mistake. Each step downward felt heavier, as if the rig itself resisted our approach, testing our resolve and our adherence to the rules that govern survival here. By the time we reached the lower deck, the lights above us were struggling to stay illuminated, struggling against the storm's assault on the rig's power grid. The metal floors were slick with condensation, and the ambient temperature had dropped sharply, amplifying the oppressive sense of dread that clung to every corner. I moved cautiously, flashlight in hand, eyes scanning the maze of conduits, pumps, and machinery that had claimed the attention of countless crew members before me. Jensen followed closely, and I could sense the tension radiating off him like static electricity. The blackness that accompanied a partial blackout had a way of stretching perception, of making even familiar corridors seem alien and threatening. One wrong move and the rule would be meaningless. Ahead, a panel indicated that one of the rig's pressure regulation systems had faltered. I swallowed hard, aware that the instinct to intervene could be fatal if attempted alone. The blinking red light pulsed intermittently, a silent alarm that tested my restraint. I reminded Jensen silently of Rule 10, urging him to stay close, reminding him that even approaching the panel without careful coordination could invite catastrophe. The machinery around us vibrated subtly, as though responding to our presence, waiting for us to falter, waiting for the moment curiosity outweighed caution. I clenched my gloves, feeling the tension build, and I knew that the shadows cast by the flickering lights concealed shapes we could not fully comprehend. We paused at the junction leading to the failed system, considering our next move carefully. The blackness beyond the corridor's end was dense, suffocating, and almost tactile, pressing against our faces even through helmets. Jensen hesitated, asking if we should attempt the repair anyway, and I shook my head firmly, silently reminding him of the rule. The rig had a way of luring workers into critical errors, exploiting isolation to ensure no one could intervene before disaster struck. Each pulse of the metal beneath our feet echoed like a warning, vibrating through my bones and demanding obedience. Even with the lights partially operational, the threat was immediate, and the margin for error non-existent. We edged forward slowly, sticking to the illuminated portions of the walkway, our movements deliberate and synchronized. Every handhold, every footstep felt like a test, not only of skill, but of adherence to the survival protocol. The machinery's faint thrum shifted beneath us, irregular and unpredictable, keeping us on edge. Shadows stretched across the walls, elongating unnaturally, and I could feel the rig observing, calculating, reacting to our compliance with Rule 10. Jensen's breathing was shallow but measured, and I knew he was relying on me as much as I relied on the rules that had guided me thus far. The weight of potential consequences pressed on both of us with unrelenting force. As we approached the area of the critical system, the lights flickered more violently, creating distorted, dancing shadows that seemed to mimic our every movement. I leaned against the railing briefly, steadying myself, and glanced at Jensen, who returned a tense, uncertain look. My hands traced the edge of the walkway cautiously, feeling the subtle vibrations that indicated the rig's sentience and movement. Every instinct screamed to wait, to ensure we were not alone, to obey the rules strictly. The emergency lighting highlighted the narrow corridor, revealing pipes and conduits, twisting in complex patterns, some appearing to bend unnaturally under the interplay of shadows. I reminded myself silently, one final time, that attempting any repair alone in this state was not just dangerous, it could be fatal. Jensen and I exchanged a look, both of us fully aware that stepping into the blackout zone, without coordination, could invite disaster beyond comprehension. I signaled for him to follow carefully, keeping the walkway between us as a barrier from whatever might be lurking, just out of sight. The rig's vibrations beneath our boots seemed to grow sharper, more deliberate, almost communicating, warning us of the consequences of breaking Rule 10. The dim lighting played tricks on our eyes, creating phantom shapes in the shadows that flickered with the rig's pulse. Every nerve in my body was alert, sensing the potential for catastrophe should we fail to respect the rule, and yet the compulsion to investigate the red warning lights tugged at my mind with subtle urgency. We reached the panel, but I did not touch it. Instead, I positioned myself strategically so that Jensen and I could both observe it without breaching protocol. The machinery hummed with faint life, the vibrations underfoot synchronized with the flickering lights above. I forced my breathing to remain steady, repeating the rules silently, letting them ground me in a world that felt increasingly unreal. The rig's almost sentient presence seemed to press closer, a reminder that Rule 10 existed not merely for operational safety, but for protection from forces beyond comprehension. Jensen's gloved hand hovered over the edge of the walkway, tense and uncertain, and I nodded subtly to remind him that adherence was the only chance we had. The shadows in the corner of the room shifted slightly, revealing the faint outline of a figure that seemed almost human, but moved with unnatural stiffness. My pulse quickened, but I remained rooted to the rule, knowing that any sudden move could provoke disaster. The rig's vibrations shifted in response to our restraint, subtle but unmistakable, as if measuring our ability to comply under duress. I whispered to Jensen, "We wait, together." He nodded, eyes wide, and kept his hands on the railing. The lights flickered violently again, plunging parts of the corridor into darkness, yet we stayed where we were, knowing that Rule 10 was our tether to survival. Then, without warning, a shadow moved closer to the panel, and the faint outline of machinery, or something imitating machinery, shifted toward us. I felt a chill run through my gloves, the weight of the rig's awareness pressing in like a tangible force. Jensen tensed beside me, and I silently instructed him to remain still, focusing on the lit area and the rules that had kept us alive through the previous trials. The flickering lights cast grotesque, elongating shadows that seemed to follow our every motion, yet we did not act. The rig was testing us once more, gauging our obedience to Rule 10, and every second that passed heightened the tension, making each heartbeat a countdown in itself. The panel's warning lights blinked in irregular sequences, casting reflections that danced like living figures across the metal walls. I could feel the energy in the room shift, almost sentient, as though the rig were deciding whether our compliance was sufficient. Every vibration, every faint shift of air, reminded me that attempting a repair alone in this blackout could unleash consequences we were not prepared to face. Jensen's grip on the railing tightened, knuckles white beneath his gloves, and I whispered that we must remain still, quiet, and together. Rule 10 had always been absolute, and now its weight pressed on us with undeniable authority. And then from the darkest corner of the blackout zone, a faint ripple in the shadows hinted at movement approaching the panel, something deliberate, intelligent, and aware of our restraint. It was the first time I realized that obeying Rule 10 might not be enough to save us. The shadows thickened around the failed panel, and Jensen and I stepped back slowly, shaken from what we had seen moving in the blackout zone. I felt the pressure of the rig like a weight on my spine, and I whispered to him that we had reached Rule 11. Never respond to anything that uses your voice in the dark, the one no one wanted to talk about. The air carried an unnatural stillness, like the rig was holding its breath, waiting to see what we would do. I remembered the stories, the ones older mechanics shared in hushed tones about figures mimicking crew voices during blackouts. My chest tightened as I sensed something standing just beyond the faint reach of our lights, observing us quietly. We held our ground, watching the dark corridor pulse with shifting shadows that moved like slow waves beneath the flickering lights. I forced my breathing to steady as Jensen whispered, asking what Rule 11 actually protected us from, and I told him that the worst thing on this rig wasn't the machinery, but what moved around it during the dark hours. The rig had always felt alive, but now it seemed aware, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to test the final rule. The cold air brushing against my gloves felt like the faintest touch, deliberate and unsettling. I sensed something studying us, trying to figure out the next move we might make. Jensen looked ready to bolt, but I grabbed his sleeve and shook my head, reminding him that running in the dark was the fastest way to die up here. The corridor stretched ahead of us like a hungry mouth, widening with each flicker of the failing lights. Shadows rolled along the walls in gentle waves, bending unnaturally far from the shapes casting them. My throat tightened when I noticed one shadow moving independently, not tied to any person or object. Jensen asked softly if I saw it too, and I answered without looking away that this was why the rule existed in the first place. There were things in the dark that listened closely, waiting for the moment you answered back. We kept walking, slow and synchronized, each step echoing faintly off the damp metal floor. I felt the rig's heartbeat and the vibration under my boots, irregular and almost agitated, like it wanted to warn us or push us somewhere we did not want to go. The emergency light sputtered again, plunging us into darkness for a heartbeat before flickering back. In that brief moment, I sensed something standing between us and the corridor ahead, tall and motionless. When the lights returned, the space was empty, yet Jensen and I both stopped, realizing silently that we had seen the same thing. I whispered that the figure wasn't what we needed to worry about. It was what came after. We neared the maintenance junction, where emergency systems were barely holding the power grid together. The rig groaned deeply beneath us, and Jensen muttered that it sounded almost frustrated. I told him not to think about it that way, but even as I said it, I knew he was right. The rig felt aware, reactive, almost emotional. The corridor narrowed as we moved forward, the metal walls closing around us like ribs constricting a vital organ. Somewhere behind us, a faint shift of air made Jensen turn his head sharply, and I grabbed his arm again, shaking my head slowly. Responding to anything in this darkness could end everything. When we reached the lower walkway that connected to the generator room, the lights finally stabilized, though they were dim and tinted with a sickly yellow hue. The space ahead felt colder, and the distant silhouettes of machines stood like silent watchers. I scanned the shadows carefully, noticing a faint motion between two large storage crates. Jensen tensed, stepping back, whispering if I had seen it move. I told him to stay quiet and avoid direct eye contact with anything that seemed out of place. The rig rewarded silence, not acknowledgement, especially during these unstable hours. We walked again, keeping our eyes forward, the rule echoing in my mind like a mantra. Then I heard it, my own voice. It drifted gently from the corridor behind us, calm and steady, calling my name with a tone identical to mine. Jensen froze immediately, and I could feel him trembling beside me, staring ahead with wide eyes. My breath caught, and every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to answer, to confront whatever was mimicking me. But the rule was absolute. You never respond, never acknowledge, never answer anything that uses your voice in the dark. I whispered without turning, "Keep walking, do not look back, do not speak." Jensen nodded slowly, though I could feel how close he was to breaking. We moved forward again, but the voice behind us shifted tone, becoming urgent and impatient, calling my name louder, asking why I was ignoring it. I felt my throat tighten painfully as I forced my steps to remain steady, aware that the distance between us and the voice wasn't increasing. It was following us at the same pace, matching our movements in unsettling synchronization. Jensen whispered shakily that he thought the voice sounded irritated, and I whispered for him not to acknowledge it. Something in the darkness behind us giggled softly through my voice, a sound that cut through my spine like ice. I kept walking, knowing that turning around would mean we'd never see daylight again. As we stepped into the narrow passage leading to the generator room, the temperature dropped further, turning the air sharp and brittle. The lights above flickered in a pattern that almost seemed intentional, as though the rig was trying to guide or warn us. The voice behind us softened again, almost gentle, calling my name with a pleading tone. I ignored it completely, keeping my eyes locked on the faint glow ahead. Jensen whispered that he wanted to run, and I told him he could run, only if he wanted the darkness to catch him faster. He stayed beside me, though I could feel his panic tightening with every step. The corridor widened slightly near the generator room entrance, and I felt a shift in air pressure that made my ears sting. The voice behind us stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was worse than the mimicry. I paused, listening carefully, trying to sense where the thing had moved. Jensen whispered anxiously, asking if it had gone, and I told him not to trust the quiet. The stillness felt calculated, like a predator waiting for us to relax. My chest ached from controlling my breathing, but I forced myself to remain steady, knowing we had not escaped anything yet. The lights above the generator room door flickered once more, then stabilized in a dim but steady glow. I reached for the handle slowly, careful not to make unnecessary noise. As we stepped inside, the humming of backup generators filled the space, low and steady, offering a false sense of safety. Jensen exhaled shakily, thinking we were safe, but I shook my head, telling him the rule didn't stop applying just because we entered a brighter room. He gulped nervously and nodded, though I could see the weight of exhaustion tugging at his face. A moment later, from the far corner of the generator room, my voice whispered again, not from behind us this time, from somewhere in front of us, and this time, it whispered Jensen's name too. I realized, with cold clarity, that the rule didn't tell us what to do when the voice came from more than one direction. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.